So how we thought we'd do this is for each workshop group, the leader of that group, or in your case, Carrie, you were kind of the co-leader, because Dan's had to leave early, to feedback and maybe invite someone from your group to join you if they would like to. So we can get a sense of what you've been talking about. So, and we have a microphone to be passed around, and we've been asked to ask you to speak into it quite close to the mouth, as it's working better that way. So maybe I will hand over to you, Carrie, and we'll start with your group.
Hello. So Dan's had to leave, so I'm going to cover for him. And the conversation we had was pretty wide-ranging. So if anybody from the group wants to chip in because I've got it wrong or I haven't said something that's an important point, then wave your hand. Yeah, we talked about, I guess we heard from people as to why they were here and what their sort of expectations were. There was something in there about it being really hard to kind of get people to commit to doing things. So how do you kind of create a sense of movement without having to then kind of sign your life away and go to something or join a committee or something like that? We talked about, there were some people who were kind of really honest about just feeling a bit like, I'm not sure what this is all about still. I don't really know what the expectation is here. I don't know what we can do on a practical level. So there was a kind of a bit of conversation about that. And I don't know if we even necessarily resolved things for people, but I just think it's really good to even be having those conversations. That was felt quite positive. And then I was going to hand over to you if you want to sort of remake your points then.
I think there were possibly two questions. One of the questions that seemed to come up was, that I seemed to pull out from the workshop, was whether people were, whether this organisation was artists representing artists, or a lot of the discussion was artists working for a bigger common good, whether our creative thinking could be for society and could solve problems for society. As an art teacher, going through, I don't know how many people are here involved in art. I suppose in education, I suppose everybody considers themselves in some part to be part of education. But art education is going through a big traumatic change at the moment. One of the justifications we always use for just for teaching art is that it teaches creative thinking. It creates people who can solve problems, who can go into industry and solve big problems. But in the end, when someone calls on an artist, it's usually after a decision's been made, and then you just need a sculpture to put in the middle of it, or a picture to hang on the wall inside it. And so I was personally, excuse me, my input into the workshop was, wow, I didn't know there were so many artists who were interested in things other than just putting things on walls, and were actually interested in using the creative thinking that we teach in schools to actually solve social problems. So that was about as far as I got from the workshop.
Thanks. Anyone else who was in the workshop? Have I missed anything massive? No? Okay, cool.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to hand over to you now, Esther, but I'm going to read out a statement that you brought along before you start. Once a society loses the capacity to dialogue, all that's left is a cacophony of voices battling it out to see who wins and who loses. There's no capacity to go deeper, to find a deeper meaning that transcends individual views and self-interest. It seems reasonable to ask whether many of our deeper problems in governing ourselves today, the so-called gridlock and loss of mutual respect and caring, might not stem from this lost capacity to talk with one another, to think together as part of a larger community, which I think is a really nice comment for today. So thanks for bringing that.
And that's the way we started our workshop. I tried to consolidate the questions that we were to be furthering and asking today into a natty 1 A4 sheet of paper, which I handed out to the rest of the group. Now, I had a great idea that we'll split up into 2 groups, 2 or 3 groups, post-it notes, flip chart papers, and just go through it, and then at the end, consolidate the views by sections, okay? So I would now like to invite to the fore, you'll see what happened, Rosalind, Angela, Freddie, and Sally. It's a bit of a performance as well. Come up to the front, come up here, yeah. This was one, that's okay.
I think with all of the groups, getting a group of artists together, there's kind of very diverse practices and experience and involvement with various things. So we both were in different groups. So do you want to talk about yours?
I think we had 4 main areas we were given to look at, which was strategic involvement, personal impact. It's not working. Strategic involvement, personal impact, campaigning and communication. And I think what we realised were that we were already doing it, and that a lot of the ways we want to do it, we want to challenge the word of just using campaigning. We want to find other vocabulary and other words to explain the kinds of levels that we're already involved in. So, for example, some people are already involved in their local hospice or on a PTA group or in an environment group as an artist and having input in that way. Some people want to do things in a very slow way over a year. Some people want to do flash mob over a week. So there's a real variety of ways that you can respond and affect change. Is there anything else my group would like to say about that?
The issue about doing what you're actually capable and able, willing to do, having to be realistic about being who you are.
I think our group was similar. I mean, really, it was part of the campaigning and representation idea is that there's 93 or so people in this room who know what, or at least interested in what AIR's doing, and that if you tell 5 more people, then next time there'll be 500 of us, and we will be able to make more of an effective change. But we will have to communicate within our own peer groups and networks that there is a body that is trying to do something. And flash mobs was kind of an idea where us time-restrained artists could get together in our regional areas and do one thing for 1 hour collectively and make a real impact that will actually get us sort of seen by other organisations, government bodies, by the public, and get them interested. And also just that we're all making a change by making our work and valuing that, really, so to keep on doing that.
It doesn't have to be serious, we can be having fun.
Definitely.
Thank you very much. So, Manick.
Yes, we had a lively discussion around the 4 areas. We didn't stick to the formula in that sense, but I think we touched on a lot of the aspects around strategy, campaigning, communication, and the kind of impact that artists make in social or civic or artistic ways. There was a very good plurality of practices in our group, and from people who work very much in social participation and engagement to some artists who are much more studio-based. So that was an interesting moment of debate, I think, where what does AIR, as a body, a representational body of artists campaign around? Is it very much about from an artistic point of view, or is it actually touching on other social issues? Certainly in terms of the impact that people make, there was some that are much more active than others in social spheres. So, for example, working in their locality, in the neighbourhood, on art projects, and others that don't really kind of do that kind of work. So it was a lively debate, very lively debate, I thought, and an unruly bunch, which was great. But one of the key things that did come up was about, AIR is about artists or representation, and one thing that came out quite strongly is that the need for artists to have that visibility and representation on certain bodies. Now, whether that is various initiatives that involves a creative outcome, maybe sort of regeneration projects or public art or arts in hospitals, that the artist is very rarely engaged in those dialogues and those sort of initial thinking around that. So that was one of the a lot of focus was given to about representation of artists on organisational structures or decision-making bodies. There was a bit of an interesting debate about the sort of not wanting to sit around the kind of bureaucracy of being an artist, the art bureaucrat, and whether some other artists who are much more dynamic prefer the kind of more smaller autonomous approaches to being artists and activists. So there was some interesting thoughts on that. But one thing that came out quite strongly was about information, and obviously AN is an information body, and AIR has a relationship with AN. But the key thing about sharing and pooling knowledge and having a sort of knowledge bank. So if an artist has been ripped off, and that experience can be learned about how not to get ripped off, but bad contracts or so forth. That kind of information is there. Now AN does have those knowledge banks about rates of pay and so forth, but maybe sometimes there might be a need for more actually just calling a helpline and being able to speak to people is something that I think was coming across at times when you just need to find something quite quickly rather than pulling through so much information and knowledge that might be in on the net or on a website. There was one thing that came out quite strongly was about the rules of engagement in terms of having someone suggested 3 rules of engagement for the artist in any kind of relationship, whether that is a contractual relationship or being on representing artists on bodies, and that's about being involved and being respected. I can't remember the third one though. What was the third? Being paid, of course, yes. Most importantly, yes, that artists are freelance. They're not on full-time salaries. They don't get. They're not on pay-as-you-earn, and therefore, as a freelance, they should be paid for being on steering committees. Or probably it's more difficult if it's a not-for-profit charity or being a trustee, because you're not supposed to be paid for that. But certainly with examples like the Turning Point. The Arts Council network, of the Turning Point network, was one of the key things that came up, was that artists, firstly, not all of the Turning Point hubs have artists on their steering committee, and that's something that needs to be addressed, and also being paid to do that. There was a lot of debate around the kind of social function of art, and obviously, we had artists that do that kind of work and then others that don't. So whether, AIR is this organisation that is being a lobbying or campaigning group around that was maybe not resolved. But in terms of communications, they felt there needed to be, again, sort of communication internally for AIR as a body, in terms of maybe those kind of knowledge sharing and pooling, but also externally in terms of how artists communicate to the wider public and what it does. And someone said that the artist needs to shout more about what they do and what they do best, and maybe that's not heard much. You know, what they do best is making art. But you know, how newsworthy is that? Is something. But also, you know, artists who play very active roles in other spheres. But also about the importance of creative ideas, and that creative ideas permeate through a lot of other aspects of our lives. When we kind of thought about a campaign issue, one interesting thing that came out was that, I can't remember which country did this, but they had a kind of almost like an art strike, a no arts day, and maybe someone might want to just kind of, I forgot who mentioned that about the no arts day. Sally, you spoke about the no arts day, didn't you?
Yes, that was a nice one. Sorry, I had a hard time finding where everybody was. I had to get something to eat because I had a headache. I attended a conference, and I think LP, where you and Chris were both at this. Iceland ran into a huge financial crisis, and its funding for the arts was completely wiped out, practically. So they decided they had to have a big impact to make a difference. So they had a no art day. I think it was supposed to carry on longer. But they covered up some major public sculptures. You couldn't listen to the radio if you're going to listen to music. You couldn't watch a film on television. You weren't supposed to look at art in your own home or whatever. And just within a few hours, the impact had hit, and they realized, well, you can't not fund the arts. You know, it does affect every aspect of our lives. And they got, Iceland's doing quite well. It's doing quite a number of things now. Has a permanent residency in Berlin, and various things like that began to happen. My little bit of info.
Did I miss anything else out? Any other key areas?
Yeah, we're talking about best practice, disseminating the toolkit to other sectors outside of visual arts. But let's get, you know, best practice in education on curatorial courses, for example. So, you know, there's a sort of rules of engagement, if you like, which is adhered to, not only by the artist, but by the creator, by the institutions, etc. So it becomes norm.
Thanks. And actually, one of our members of the group said something quite important, which is that artists see the world differently, and that's something that does need to be borne in mind, as opposed to you know, a civil servant, or as opposed to a bureaucrat, and that's very important to remember that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it seemed to me that the context for this discussion is really how can AIR represent artists' interests at a very difficult time when public funding's being majorly cut back. And I think that some of the suggestions were we need more public funding. I think that there was definitely a case to be made for that, but there were some other suggestions that came out in terms of ways that artists could develop relationships of collaboration among each other. Which I found particularly interesting. One idea for a campaign was a campaign to value art education in schools. There's been a very successful campaign in London to revalue music education. So there's a kind of model there already. But art education in schools being majorly cut back. And obviously, if you don't do art at school, you can't go and do it at university. So a public campaign with artists talking about essentially their art teacher, how they inspired them, how much they learned at school, etc. I think there could be some kind of mileage in that. There was the point about artists being paid was also made. You know, I think that artists are doing a job, and you know, they should be paid like any other profession. Another lady made the point about copyright and enforcement of copyright, particularly on the internet. She can probably pitch in to elaborate on that. The idea I really liked was essentially forms of proposals for, this is just my opinion, for ways in which artists could develop, I guess, self-reliance in hard times. And so ways in which people can swap resources they have. So there was an idea of studio swaps. So artists who can't afford to go on holiday, or artists in London who want to go and have a studio in the country, artists in the country who want to go and see some galleries in London. Right, at the moment it's quite difficult for that to happen. It costs hundreds of pounds for you to come to London to see the galleries, but your studio's in Yorkshire. But already there's models of people swapping houses, and they're just strangers. So within the arts community, if you can have ways in which artists can say, you know, my studio's empty for a couple of weeks, who wants to use it? And so within the community, then you can develop forms of self-reliance and sharing the resources that do exist. Another idea, which actually was also suggested by one of our Manifesto Club members a few years ago. We didn't do it, but I think it's a really good idea, which is having free art schools, i.e. setting up your own art school. The point being is that if art education now costs 27 grand, that's a lot of money to go, that's a big debt to leave with when you're probably not going to make that much money after. So the point being that if you can get a warehouse or a space and a teacher, then you can actually, on a covering your cost basis, set up an art school, right? So essentially informal forms of art education outside the main institutions, and the potential for doing that, and also putting some pressure on all the big artists who've made millions to actually give something back. So it's all right for Gormley to do a campaign saying, oh, don't cut arts funding, but how about he actually finances a bit of an art school, you know, because really it's not that much money compared to what he has in his bank account, I assume. So, you know, but essentially various forms of collaboration where artists can strengthen their own networks. And all of those could be quite simple to organize, you know, in terms of on AN's website or through AIR or whatever. Yeah, so those are the ideas that really struck me, but I'm sure there are members of the group who were struck by different things, so they should pitch up now. Okay.
Yeah, just I guess enforce what Josie was saying, and it's about artists being social pioneers and really emphasising on what was talked about before, and how creativity is really undervalued, and how artists can actually become part of really important teams in social change with engineers, designers, people who run the finances, local government. You know, they are really, really important. Well, we are really important, and we should be valued by communities. And maybe if schools appreciated creativity, and then parents would understand creative value, then it might change.
Is anyone else from the copyright? The lady who's concerned about copyright. Okay. You don't want to. Okay. But basically, just images on the internet, particularly photographs, being seen as free. I think that's another thing about artists' work being seen as free, and various ways in which either through DACs or those kinds of organisations, or different techniques, I suppose, of protecting photo rights on the internet, in terms of artists being paid for what they do.
Judith.
Well, much of what we discussed has already been covered by the other groups. Central to a lot of it was this notion of value and of being valued by arts organisations as well as the public. And so a lot of it covered things like representation. Turning Point was mentioned again, and the notion of being paid to attend once you were invited. But we also discussed quite a lot about sort of sharing, and again this notion of sharing skills or also sharing spaces, And one of the things that was suggested was this notion of artists organising on a local and regional basis, and of, I think I'm right in this, of working with the arts organisations in their areas to try and effect change in that way. And along with that was a sort of need to recognise and value the fact that artists are not always pursuing their practice on a full-time basis, that there are a lot who have got other jobs or commitments which mean that they can't take up opportunities like residencies, for instance, if they're long-term things, which doesn't mean that they're not serious artists, it just means that they have other commitments. So there was a sort of notion of entering, I suppose, into a dialogue with regional arts organisations about that, and this notion of the Let's scheme. I can't think of anything else. There probably was. Anybody? No, they don't. Anyone else in the group want to say anything? No? Oh, yes.
I think there were, in my group particularly, there were some artists who were beginning to form their own units together. And I was thinking that it would be a good idea if they were able to get together with their regional public gallery, and that perhaps some small funded hub could be established so that all these different units of artists would have a place to come together and to share ideas, share resources, maybe to have talks organised. One particular person was very interested in curators and understanding curators a little bit more, and so coming to a regional public gallery probably would be a good place to find that out, and that this should be funded so that the talks and the opportunities, that there is some money perhaps from the Arts Council or within the budget of the regional gallery to pay for these local artists to come together. So that local, there's often a discrimination perhaps between regional artists and local artists, and sometimes the local artists who are also regional artists can feel misrepresented as just local artists, but actually they're regional artists who live locally and who are professional and want to, I hope that makes sense, but yeah. So about being valued, so that the local artists who are working regionally are valued and are able to have a voice.
Just very, very quickly, we were talking about hubs and regional hubs, but we were also talking about the value of digital communication and the fact that they both play a role in how we share skills, share knowledge. So that's basically it. Sort of both ways of communicating.
It was just to add to that thing about hubs, which it came across there. We did talk about funding for it, but we also talked about a non-monetary economy whereby things are shared. So galleries such as perhaps First Sight would give a room for free for a smaller group to meet as a hub on a regular basis, as an example.
Just a very quick feed in from my experience of living and working in Northern Ireland for the past 35 years. Belfast has had since the late 1970s an extremely vibrant visual arts scene, which has largely resided in galleries and studio spaces and activities outside gallery spaces, very importantly, organised very largely on a voluntary basis by artists themselves, is extremely successful. It is very often very in your face, out there, gets people noticed and actually gets them onto the international stage by virtue of doing so. I think it's a really good model. I suggest you come and look at it.
Tessy? Tessy and Jamie.
Oh God. Basically, a lot of it's been covered, and please chime up, anyone in the group, please. We talked about the mapping the institutions or the places that we would have to go to, and how big they are, and how we would approach them, or what they exist for, or how we go to them. We did talk about the idea of, it's like the idea of benefit. A lot of it came down to, in the end, basically the idea of value, and how we're valued as artists, and how we're respected as artists, or seen either as an education system or as in the fact that we have a job to do. It is a job, and we do it, and it has value, and it has needs to be represented. And then, so we kind of talked about like what institutions exist, and then sort of when someone very wisely said, like, do we have to follow that model, or can we come up with our own kind of, model ourselves, and circumnavigate that, and to do what we want without being dictated to, or becoming a form filler, or a person that everything else exists before their artwork, and their artwork exists first, which, I don't know, seems... anything else? Yeah, so then we started to sum it up in one word, which is really hard. So these are the ones that we come up with, like making work, respect, cooperation, it has an intrinsic value, value of the arts and education, and the power of a local group. But then, like, not the idea of it being local, that idea, I really struggle with this because I'm a local artist, even to this building, but I'm always considered a local artist and never anything bigger than that. And it's that idea to fight, to compete at that level, especially when you have a building like this in your back garden, which is a really brilliant and amazing thing, and it's trying to have this international and this, you being local and international, trying to compete at that level at the same time. Is that, anyone from my group want to pipe up or sort of help me out here? Oh, sorry, yeah.
I think one thing that came out really strongly from the discussion was this idea of the kind of national structures, which in some places may not be the best places where change would happen, but AIR needing to have a place at the table, but really trying to kind of invest in and resource in some way, whether that's in kind or not, local engagement and activity. And basically the question of how is AIR best placed to do that to the membership, I thought came out really strongly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, all the workshop leaders and speakers who stimulated. I mean, for me, it was very wonderful to not only be here with you as a fellow artist. We're all different, we all have different backgrounds, different levels of experience, we're all different ages, come from different parts of the country. And just the fact that we're here, I find personally moving. So I want to thank you for taking the commitment to be here, because it means something not just to you individually, but to the whole event, and of course to AIR as well. So I just thought I would, in my way, do my own response here. Dialogue, inspirational, involved, respected, paid, included, represented, shout, knowledge bank, information, a no art day. a studio, swap, make it work. Education, best practice, AIR, artist representation, collaboration, the value of art education, especially in schools. Community, copyright. Free art schools, and there is one in Glasgow actually. Strengthen your own networks, artists as social pioneers. We are really important. Yes, we are. Value, being valued, representation, sharing. Sharing skills and spaces. We're not all full-time artists, and actually that is okay. A funded hub, units of artists. Understanding curators. Regional is local, local is fine. The value of digital communication, setting up a non-monetary economy. Northern Ireland has it sorted. The idea of value, doing what we want, how we want to. Respect, cooperation, the power of the local group. So, I would like just to remind you thank you. Just to thank you again, and also to everybody here. Just if you could possibly fill out the evaluation forms before you wander through for a drink, that would be wonderful, because then we're sure to get them. And could we have a round of applause for everybody?